The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Diane D. Rodriguez, known affectionately as Dee Dee. She's a registered mental health counselor intern with a private practice in Melbourne, Florida. With a passion for grief care, education, and advocacy, Dee Dee can often be heard saying that she helps the bereaved heal their matters of their heart, mind, body, and soul as they discover meaningful living despite everyday grieving. Dee Dee's grief specialty focuses on traumatic and sudden loss, child loss, parental loss, and the loss of a spouse or significant other. Her vision is to create a culture where grief care is embraced empathetically and compassionately, so that grief illiteracy and avoidance is replaced with compassionate connections that nourish a life in alignment with each individual's authentic well-being. Hi, Dee Dee, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Lourdes, and thank you for having me.
I am so excited about our conversation because I feel that the work that you're doing is so needed, and there is such a discomfort in general around the conversation of death, which I think makes it even more difficult for those who are grieving to get the support that they need.
I would agree. The focus is always about all the other things that can distract us from just feeling the emotions that grief kind of bring up in each and every one of us. And so our tendency is to just avoid the conversation altogether. You know, we're raised with this preconceived information and knowledge that we're either grieving too much or we're grieving too little or we're grieving the wrong way. And so nobody really understands what grief is or how it should be. And when you're in actual grief, that can be really difficult as well, because you just don't know if you're doing it right. You don't know what normal is.
Dee Dee, can you start off by sharing, how you were drawn to this area?
Well, my story with grief is a long-standing one. I am what you call a rainbow baby. So my first sibling died as an infant just a few days after my mom had him. And I think that really was the beginning of who I was supposed to be and the work that I was supposed to be doing on this earth. But I didn't really discover that until many years later, like in my 30s, that was in my late 30s, that was part of my calling. I certainly can remember the first death experience that I had was around the age of 4, and walking into a church service and seeing the deceased lady who was a family friend, and I believe she used to work for my grandfather from the stories that I hear. And even to this day, and I'm 47 years old, if I should be so bold to tell my age, I can see her. I can see how beautifully and meticulously her hair was laid out, how her clothes was just pure, and how peaceful she looked in a church, and how so many people came to pay their respects with love, and just admiration. And I had no idea who she was. So since then, there was many, many experiences with death, with aiding the bereaved, with participating in rituals and ceremonies around those who were dying or who had died. And I really thought that I had a good grip on what grieving and and bereavement was all about, and the death and dying portion of life, until my own son died. And then I was brought into a totally different aspect and awakening of how avoidant society really is about talking about topics around death, dying, and bereavement, and how disenfranchised a parent who has lost a child really is and really becomes to be in society. I mean, there isn't even a word or a label or a title for a parent who loses a child. And in that in itself is a lack of validation and even just looking for the help. I mean, the moment that I know from my own experience that when I went searching for help, the moment that I would say, I lost my son to cancer, 9 times out of 10, it went in a direction of, I'm so sorry. And then it was about the person's discomfort, rather attuning to my hurt and my needs or my pain, which when you're in survivor mode, and you're a compassionate or empathetic person, you tend to see that, but at the same time, it minimizes your own self-worth in that journey.
This is just powerful. So many, you can see how there are parts of this experience that you don't really have in your conscious awareness until you're experiencing it, right?
Right.
I think that's interesting also how you described how, really from the very beginning, you've had I would say, a very special connection or relationship with the experience of death. And still, after losing your son, it took it to a whole other level.
Right.
So, Dee Dee, one of the things I noticed as I was preparing for our conversation and looking through your work is a metaphor or an image that shows up everywhere. You speak about the butterfly, and I wanted to ask you, why is this meaningful? Why is this a metaphor that works when you are grieving or supporting those who are grieving?
One of my grandmothers, my paternal grandmother, in fact, used to say that the butterflies are heaven-sent kisses of an angel. Before my son died, I used to be part of a childhood cancer organization called Candlelighters for Childhood Cancer. And I led a parent support group for Hispanic parents. And in designing the logo for that, what came up for me was the butterfly. Shortly before my son died, as I went into the hospital on the sidewalk, there was a dead butterfly. And then after, while we were interning him and we were doing the blessings for the caskets and his remains, and before we laid him to complete rest, there were butterflies that came in and out. And one was white and one was yellow, chills. Right? And they were so sporadic, and people who know me and who knew my son and who knew our family dynamics. My son had ADHD, and he was a very obnoxious and rambunctious little child. So when we had these obnoxious little butterflies flying in and out of the crowd, it was not only spiritual, but it was also validating that I was right where I needed to be, with the people that I needed to be surrounded with, in a moment in a life that I did not understand at that time. But it had brought me hope and a sense of calm to know that that was used as a signal to catch my attention, to really just let me look at things in a different perspective. And in hindsight, of course, I can see all the connections, right? At that time, it wasn't as clear as it is now. But I can say that ever since then, on some of my darkest days, because I still have some pretty dark days, the yellow butterfly always appears.
Wow.
It has never left me. It's been 16 years since my son died.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Made my eyes water, gave me goosebumps just hearing that. I think too, I love how you said that at the time you experienced it, but you didn't have the clarity till much later of exactly what it all meant. But I love that intuitive knowing, though, in that moment that this means something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hold on to this. You notice me. It was more of notice me. I'm not going away. Because at first when that happened, I'll have to tell you, I thought I had imagined it. It wasn't until about a week or two later that somebody had made the comment to me that said, "What did you think about the butterflies?" Because these butterflies, when they came in under the canopy or the overhang, whatever it is that we call that, they landed on the flowers in his casket. And then they visited each side of the group around his casket. And they did not leave until after the benediction was complete. So after they visited each side, they stayed around the priest who was doing the benediction. And then when he stopped doing the benediction, one went one way and one went the other. Now, some people might call that a coincidence. I call them God winks or universe winks, because we had photographers, and in my culture, it's, a lot of people will take pictures of the ceremonies of the deceased. And those butterflies were in no picture, none of them. And there were plenty of people taking pictures. Yeah. So I thought I had imagined them until somebody brought them up later on.
So, Dee Dee, I want to start with some, I guess, exploration of the languaging around this process of mindful grieving. And also, I want to go into why that's so important. But I'd like to start with, first of all, what is mindful grieving?
Mindful grieving, I think, to understand what mindful grieving is, we first should maybe identify what it's not. And it's not a cure-all, obviously. A lot of people want to move through the grief process pretty quickly. And it is not a theology or a spiritual practice or a philosophy that's tied to any one religion, dogma, or any specific belief. Really, mindful grieving is more about the awareness of the flow grief takes. It's the organic unfolding of the emotions that show up when we're grieving. But it's more than just that. It's being able to practice gentle exploration without judgment. So, intuitively speaking, we want to avoid those things that are kind of scary and that create us a lot of pain. And mindful grieving is the opposite of that. It's actually sitting in some of that discomfort without wallowing in it and just kind of observing it and being able to ask questions throughout, with like a childlike curiosity in what does this mean, or, how would this connect? So it's a piece of being able to reconcile a hurt while you're struggling on how to find meaning in life.
When, you're describing mindful grieving, you use the words or the phrase, the flow that grief takes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
I like to speak in metaphors. So when I think of the flow of grief that it takes, I kind of think of like if we're sitting and observing the waves in the ocean. Depending on the day, sometimes you can go in and the waves kind of roll in and they're very gentle and mild and don't even produce any kind of real resistance. And then other days you can go out there and look at it, and you can tell there's a storm brewing. You can tell that as the water rolls in, there's crashing and threshing. And so when I talk about the ebbs and flows in grief, I recognize that some days it's a little bit more gentler and other days it's a little bit more tumultuous.
Why is understanding or being conscious of the flow of grief, why is that important to the grieving process?
One of the major reasons that it's important is because a lot of times we think that we've really done the grief work, or we believe that we're not impacted as heavily by, something or someone that we have lost, until there's some kind of trigger. And it could be a song, it could be a dream, it can be a scent, or it could be nothing at all. I mean, I know there certainly have been times that I've woken up and felt like, this is going to this day already feels kind of yucky. I'm not sure what's going to happen today. And knowing that some days it can be more peaceful and you can live with the emotions where they're not as intense or as long lasting, and other days where you can feel like you're right back or really close to ground zero where it all started. So it's important to kind of be able to recognize that you can have quiet days and then you can have other days that are not so quiet.
And I think this speaks to what you mentioned earlier, Dee Dee, about, oftentimes people wondering, am I doing this right? Is this normal? What's going on with me? And I feel like knowing that there's a flow and that this flow has different currents and different experiences helps that process.
Right. And I think the other piece is that just really thinking about that healing isn't just for our loss. It's about healing the pain in the present moment so we can move into the act of remembering without experiencing the pain consistently at the intensity or the duration of the acute grief. And what most people feel in the beginning is acute grief. It's that huge intensity that feels like you just can't catch your breath.
And so it's, again, I think if I was hearing you correctly, Dee Dee, it's the ability to hold the intensity and then learning how to be in that intensity. And then also at the same time, remember your loved one, because it's difficult to do both.
Right. And a lot of times people talk about how overwhelming the feelings are in grief, how they're feeling everything at one time. And the truth of the matter is we can only feel one emotion at a time. Now they may come in really close, like at this moment I'm feeling angry and then I'm sad and now I'm resentful and now I feel guilt and now I feel shame, but they don't all come at you at the same time. They may just follow one another. If you name what's happening, it kind of takes away the power of that emotion, or it minimizes it a little bit, diminishes it.
So as simple as maybe being able to recognize I'm feeling anger.
Right.
And then right after that, I'm feeling sadness.
Right.
So you put together this amazing journal.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's really wonderful. As I was going through it, one of the things that grabbed my attention was you speak about how important it is to really pay attention to the languaging or the wording that is used around this grieving process. Could you speak about that?
Sometimes I think that when we are in grief, we end up saying things like, I can't live without them. And I want to say that that's one of the biggest things that I hear consistently as people come into the Grieving Wellness Center, is that I can't live without them. I'm so sad. And so it's kind of like a limiting belief, or what some people would just say an oxymoron, because the truth of the matter is that the fact that you're just sitting there saying that proves that you are living without them. You may not want to, but you are. Language matters.
Yeah, I can feel the energetic shift with that, or maybe also a shift from I can't live without this person to it's very hard to live without this person. And so, when you are, supporting someone who's grieving, how do you begin to bring more awareness to the language and help them to become more mindful of how they are describing their experience?
Well, I think that in the beginning, I do my practice a little bit different than most people. When I'm talking about therapy, I'm the kind of psycho-emotional therapist that believes in allowing the person who's grieving to tell their story and to tell it as frequently or as long as they need to. Because part of what happens with society is that our inner circles and our supportive circles kind of get tired. They get compassion fatigue. They mean well, but they end up not supporting our needs the way that we need to be supported in the moment. So when individuals come seeking my guidance, the first part is allowing them to tell their story without editing it, without correcting it, and then just really reflecting back to them and giving words to some of the emotions that they might be going through and validating. I had one mama who came to me whose child had died by suicide, and it was a neglected overlook from an organization that was meant to keep that child safe. And so she was very angry, and just sitting there with her and validating, you have the right to be angry at this moment. You know, there was a wrongful death. And on the end of that, your child died. And the ramifications and the natural and normal consequences of that is that you're left here grieving that life. And so sometimes just validating all of that and giving words to the feelings that they have kind of shut down is the foot in the door to be able to start changing the conversation some.
It's so important, right, that someone reflects back what we're experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that in many ways, you know, not only with grief, but we know when we're hurting, you know, we're looking for that. Tell me that you're seeing me and what I'm feeling, because it also lets me know that I'm okay.
Yes.
Because I think often with grief, you know, when we're grieving, go to others for that reflection, and they are unable for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you said, it's well intentioned, unable to reflect that back, and that leaves the individual who's grieving in a very uncomfortable space.
Right. And so teaching that sensitivity, teaching individuals, doing the grief education so that they understand what grief is, and then going into allowing them to understand their grief mindset and how that has developed, and then exploring the limiting beliefs so that what I call grief blocks, so that the blocks are then being able to be moved or rearranged in a way that is more aligned to really what they innately already hold, the gifts and the talents that they already hold, that when you're in a crisis you tend to forget that you have.
So, Dee Dee, I wanted to touch on, I think, some aspects of the grieving experience that possibly most people have questions about or struggle with. And we touched on this at the beginning, and this is related also to what we're talking about right now, but it's about the difficulty in talking about death for the griever and for those around this person, you know, and the things that get in the way of this. So could you speak to that a little bit?
So for the griever, I think it's just that it's so new and so confusing, and they're bombarded by all these ideas and kind of like distorted thinking of what things are or should be based on what they've seen culturally, what they've heard other people, or maybe even their own beliefs of what grief should be like. That really just teaching them a little bit of empathy, as if, you know, what would it be like for you to support somebody else in grief? And usually if you can just kind of shift them from what they're experiencing right now to take the role of like an observer, if it was somebody else, how they would naturally care for them, then that begins to build empathy, not just for the judgment that they hold for themselves, but for the judgment or opinions or hurtful things that may be perceived that other people are saying to them at that moment. And of course, that takes a little bit of practice.
And I think, you know, this also, the difficulty in talking about death, you know, one of the other things that I wanted to talk about with you is the distraction avoidance piece, which we mentioned at the beginning, because I think this is related to the difficulty in talking about it for the one who's grieving and for those who are trying to support this individual. When it comes to distraction and avoidance, how can a person discern if it's distraction and avoidance or if it's healthy coping? How do you find that balance between being in the grief and also not staying in it, if that makes sense. Because I think that that's difficult to understand and to, again, going back to that question, am I doing it right?
I think that's a great question. And often what I see, what I observe, and what I have felt myself personally is that if there's a sense of defensiveness, receiving words or giving words, that's usually the first indication that there's some kind of intense emotion that has not been validated. So, for example, when shortly after my son died, I had a family member who called me and she was completely and totally distraught on the phone. My daughter answered the phone at the time. She couldn't understand who was on the other side, so she passed it on to my husband. And my daughter was visibly pissed off. And my husband just was over the top. And he just basically handed it over to me.
Oh my goodness.
Because of course I'm the one who just kind of am able to calm people down and, be patient enough to listen to what people have to say. And what was going on was this person felt really guilty that they had not reached out to me sooner. They had been avoiding me for the longest time, and it had gotten to the point where they could no longer avoid me. So the problem with avoidance is that the more you try to do it, the less and less it works. And the things that you try to avoid keep showing up. So of course, she said all the wrong things. She started the conversation with trying to catch her breath and saying that she understood how I was feeling. And in that moment, I was frustrated because my daughter was shaken up. I was frustrated because my husband was over the top, close to rageful. And the thought for me was, are you calling to console me? Or are you expecting me to console you and tell you you're okay? Because, you can't live with whatever it is that you're feeling right now. And certainly for me, that was a piece that shut that conversation down right then and there. That was a piece of where I was extremely defensive. I mean, looking back at it, rightfully so. And I'd like to think that I'm in tuned enough to other people's feelings and to my own so that I'm not so reactionary. But I wasn't. There was no grace in that moment for me towards this person. And I had to do a lot of work around that to forgive myself. Now, I don't have communication with her anymore since that day. I think of her every year because we were so close that our birthdays are even within the same week. So it's a person who's been with me all of my life. And even though we're not talking anymore, because I believe that my behavior makes her shy away from it, I'm at that point where I'm okay with that. And I recognize that it was a lot of defensiveness. So when you have some defensiveness showing up, that's the piece where that really kind of grabs our attention, right? When we're feeling grateful for things, our attention isn't called to it as deeply or as reactionary as when we experience discomfort or pain. Does that make sense?
It does. It really does. And it brings to mind to me, I mean, I can't think of all of them right now, but I know at least off the top of my head, 3 to 5 different instances of stories from, friends, family members, client experiences where after a death, there was some type of interaction where there was anger and defensiveness, and they are no longer speaking. Like, it's just interesting how
Right,
that happens,
right. I welcome
Yeah.
the opportunity if it shows up. I know that I've done the work around that, though I have no idea if that person has since then. Some people just kind of sweep it under the carpet, put it under the rug, sort of say.
So, one of the questions that I thought was really powerful in the journal was in the section, Dee Dee, on death being hard to accept. And you asked the question, what is it about this death that is hard for you to accept? And I thought that was a great question. And I wanted to ask you why this question? What have you seen in your work with this question?
I was very intentional with putting the word this in there. Yeah. And,
Yeah, I saw that.
I had quite a few people beta test this journal. I had clients beta test this journal because it's a really amazing interactive tool to give words where words aren't able to be voiced. And so I said this death because in grief, we experience many, many deaths. We experience many losses of relationships, whether it's the relationship is no longer there, or whether it's the actual separation of a body from our physical presence. Some things affect us a little bit deeper than others, and some don't. And it kind of gives that opportunity to be able to reflect on past experiences with grief and what is happening in the moment. I don't know about you, but I know that when, like, the actor Robin Williams died, I never met him. I never knew him, but there was a tug at my heart. I definitely grieved that loss. And it was because of the connection that I had to the idea of his work, the idea of his suffering, and the idea of the passion that he had for making people happy and helping them out of their own sadness and depression, which evolved essentially from his own life experiences. So if I were to examine some of the feelings that I had with my son and examine, not in comparison, because that's not what I want, that's not the idea or the intention behind the question, but just rather looking at it from an observer standpoint of what things are similar and what things are different, and what are the intensities attached to any emotion that's coming up, and the language that we use for each one of them.
I love that it helps the individual actually to really grieve more, grieve more thoroughly, grieve more mindfully, because you're discerning what this grief is and what previous griefs are and where you are in relationship to all the loss you've experienced. And I think that helps you also to see that this reaction I'm having, I thought it was just for this loss, but really there are these other layers to it.
Absolutely.
Right?
And I think you just hit the nail on the head that a lot of times we're focused on that particular loss, but we don't realize and we don't recognize all the losses that we will experience that is related to that initial loss. So each time that, for example, for me, every time that a child that was raised with my son passed a milestone, made it from middle school to high school, from high school to college, their first girlfriend, their first boyfriend, their first job, their first any kind of milestone, that there were many secondary losses to that initial loss. And that butterfly effect really is lifelong. It doesn't just stay in that moment. It's not for a year or 2 years or 3 years. I mean, every time there's a milestone, you can't help but be aware that there's always somebody missing.
No, Dee Dee, one of the things that you talk about, I think you had a quote on it, but I didn't write the quote down. But what you mentioned in the quote was that the significance of false positivity and the denial of darkness. I wanted you to speak to that, especially when, in light of the avoidance of grief, or trying to not grieve, or trying to distract ourselves when grieving.
Sitting in the shadows, is really kind of what comes up for me. That, what do we do when we don't want someone to see what we're really kind of going through, our authentic self? We tend to withdraw and sit in like if you're hiding in a dark place and putting on a mask to the rest of the world, pretending to be something that we are or are not for the sake of kind of like really stuffing it.
And I think too, like helping others to be more comfortable
Yeah,
too,
because
right?
you feel like a burden. You don't want to be Debbie Downer. You're afraid of calling your loved one or bringing them up. And the flip side of that is that those around you are afraid of saying their name or bringing them up because they don't want it to be hurtful for you. So it's this pull in both directions that it just feels awkward, and you tend to withdraw. You tend to avoid it because we're not able to give words to it, and we're not able to communicate it in a way that feels validating. And sometimes it's just because we don't know what we need. So we don't know how to ask for what we need.
No wonder grieving is so difficult, right? I mean, there's so many pieces to it. I can't even count how many times I've, when talking to someone and they've mentioned a loss, and maybe it's usually been several years. And then I ask, do you talk to your husband about this person? Do you talk to your sister? No, we don't talk about this. And it's just, you can see how all of these different factors hijack the grieving experience.
So going to that same example, I remember when I was grieving, I allowed my emotions to flow. And my husband, right, this real macho man that he is, really he allowed it to happen, but not as frequently. And my daughter, who was a teen at the time, dealt with her grief with a lot of anger and detachment. So you had to prove yourself worthy to be part of her life, to be trusted. And I think that's another piece of the disenfranchised grief is siblings, siblings who lose one of their siblings. They too don't have a name for that. And everybody is supporting mom and dad, and they forget about the kids. The big piece is being able to know for me that it wasn't my business how my husband grieved or how my daughter grieved. It was my business to take care of my grief first so that I could be the empathetic and compassionate person to be there for them when they allow their grief to flow in a way that was authentic to them. So for my daughter, that was with anger. For my husband, that was a good amount of time of avoidance. For my mom, it was defiance. For my dad, it was very quiet and withdrawn. And so just being able to just be open that we all grieve differently, and that even if we don't understand how another person is grieving, that we can still respect it and give them the space to do it their way.
So, Dee Dee, one of the things that I feel is a common response after the loss of an individual can lead to, I think, more of the avoidance of the grief is that statement of being strong. Like you need to be strong for your mother or be strong for each other, or I know how strong you are. Can you speak to that?
That comment and the I'm so sorry are two that I often hear come into my office that really generates a lot of turmoil, inner struggles and things. And I think that it's because others are wanting to be able to fix your grief, to kind of help you return to the place or the person you used to be before grief. They're seeking the relationship that they once had with you, the person that you used to be. They want to believe that you are strong, or to encourage you by telling you that you're strong, when on the other side, you feel everything but. You feel like you're not enough, like you're doing it wrong, like you're broken. Can't tell you how many times people walk into the therapy room and they say, I'm broken. I don't even know who I am anymore. I can't tap into who I used to be. And so pieces of that resonate, because the problem is that you're never going to be the same. Neither will your life. but it can still be good and it can still have a place for your grief despite all of that. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes absolute sense. And I think too that, again, going back to what we touched on at the beginning, Dee Dee, about the importance of languaging and wording, because that creates the filter, your experience, that when you hear the words or the way that we described how the word strong can be used, the implication is that strong is preferred, strong is good and okay. Weak is not,
exactly.
so weak is bad.
Absolutely.
Right. And you're not allowed to be weak. Please don't be weak, because I won't know what to do with you. Again, like you're going back to the importance of the language,
And I think the other piece is teaching the bereft to be able to voice what their needs are, to be able to discern what their needs are in a way that other people can hear them and understand them. Because it's really illogical to expect that you can have the same conversations or that the relationship is going to be the same. Things are different, and that's okay.
So even, the suggestion or the idea of getting back to normal that doesn't work, because you can't get back to normal. There is no normal.
Absolutely not. What is normal? I mean, what is normal in our everyday life, let alone in grief? And what I tell those who come seeking some answers to some of their questions is that in grief, everything that's abnormal is normal. Everything that we think is abnormal really is normal in the grief process. So, for some people, they feel like they have to hold on to their grief. And usually when they have to hold on to their grief, it's fear-based. If I don't show the world that I'm still grieving, or if I allow myself to enjoy life again or to find meaning in life again, then somehow I'm betraying my loved one. I'm leaving them behind. I'm forgetting about them.
So Dee Dee, is it also like almost not knowing how to choose happiness or meaning and hold on and still have that person? It's almost like if I choose something that brings me joy, I'm letting you go.
Right. And that in itself causes a lot of grief.
Yeah.
There's shame in that. There's guilt in that. How could I move on? Yet, if it was us who has died, right? Or we would want our legacy to continue, but we wouldn't want it to continue through intense pain for a person to be stuck in the fact that we're no longer with them.
So, Dee Dee, I know that we're running a little bit long, but there's just two more things I want to touch base on. This is just,
sure.
Well, I guess I'll look at it this way. How can you rush through a conversation about grief, right? So, yeah. Okay.
We could probably be talking for eons on the subject, especially with the passion behind it.
So one of the things you focus on in this amazing workbook are rituals. And I wanted you to speak to why these rituals are important. Why do they matter in grief?
I think that because we have kind of shied away from having rituals, that we've kind of lost some of the foundation of knowing or being able to grieve, right? So I look at some of I think it was last year, there was this huge trend about things to do at funerals, and it was creative ways of not having the loved one in a casket, or being more about a celebration of life. And certainly, while those things can be true and we may feel called to doing that, in there, to be able to strike the balance, there has to kind of be some kind of ceremony to not just celebrate their life, but also to say goodbye. Because even in the act of saying goodbye, you're able to welcome a hello. And what do I mean by that? So I think one of the biggest myths that we have in society is that when our loved ones die, we have to walk away. We no longer are able to keep them with us. And for me specifically, I take my son everywhere I go. every day of my life. To me, I don't see it any different than my adult daughter who lives across the United States and on the East Coast, on the West Coast, while I'm living on the East Coast. I may not see her every day. I may not speak to her every day, and I may not think of her in every waking moment, but her essence is always with me. And so I don't see it any different.
So would you say that the rituals help us to let go, to move from one space to another? And that, one of the things I think is amazing is if you look at history, every culture, every group of people, every tribe had rituals to help the people with transitions when they were at a crossroads, And like you were saying, now if the ritual is only a celebration and doesn't include the goodbye, then you are actually right there doing the avoidance of the grief and not giving it permission to be and not acknowledging it.
And there's other ways that people do that as well. I mean, there's many who, I have a loved one who says to me that when they pass, they just want there not to be any kind of memorial service. It's from the hospital or from wherever they are to the funeral parlor and then to the cemetery, only because there has to be a funeral parlor in the middle for the preparation of the body, and it's just to take them straight to the cemetery. And so that's their wish, right? You want to honor their wish. And yet, as a human being able to participate in some kind of ceremony allows for a closing and a reopening of something new to come in. So the rituals do that for us. They allow us to be able to transition from one space into another.
In your amazing journal that you put together, and of course, there's no way to possibly touch on all the really wonderful aspects of it, Dee Dee. The one thing that really, really sat with me, and I actually copied off this specific part of it, and I have been reflecting on these questions, it's a section where you talk about the things that were left unsaid. And I felt like this was so powerful, not just for those who are grieving, but actually for those who are not grieving, because it really, I think, helps you to shift into a gratitude and appreciation for what is. So could you please speak about these questions, how you chose them?
Honestly, the grief journal, I don't even remember how it started. I want to say that it has definitely been a process. I thought there were plenty of times that she was finished, and I was called to go back and add more. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to be an encyclopedia by the time I'm done. So it's interesting, the process in itself of how it came to fruition. But the things that are left unsaid, sometimes we mean to say something, we think of. For example, this morning I was doing my reflective writing, and I checked in on social media just for a few minutes, and somebody had posted something that resonated so deeply with what it was that I was reflecting in my own life and in my writing, that in a brief moment I thought I should share my reflective journaling with this person, just so that he knows that what he has said really validated what I was thinking today. And for a split second, fear sets in, right? Because it's like, oh, this is too personal. Vulnerability kind of creeps in, and that voice is like, you don't want to tell him all that. That's just too much information. And I had to sit with that for just a quick second and say, I'm being called to share it. And instead of quieting that voice, it's like telling a child, not now. I just went ahead and shared it with the preface to him saying, I felt called to share this because what you said resonated and validated so much of what I was writing, and it was reflection of what I do and why I do it. my passion for grief education and how I am constantly looking at the lens that we have in our world through grief and through grief's eyes, that had I not shared that with him, it would have been left without saying. So I don't know how he received it. It's not my responsibility to take that from him. I felt called to share it. And when I feel called to do something, even if my mind or part of me wants to judge that, I just kind of go with it and let it fall where it needs to fall. Now, it may not resonate deeply with him. I don't know. But that's like, I think one of our mentors had told me one time, I'm sorry that I took that from you when it wasn't mine to take. And so I use that a lot in my life. Am I taking this away from somebody when it's not mine to take?
So, Dee Dee, what are some of the ways that you work with and support those who are grieving? And also, what is the best way that anyone who's interested in your work can learn more about you and get in touch with you?
Of course, through my website, and it's www.livelifechanged.com, and changed is past tense. That's like the landing place to be able to schedule some phone consults or just kind of poke around and see a little bit more. It is one of those labors of love. So it's ever changing. I see my website as a living document. And so some things resonate in the moment, and you may come back and visit it 3 months from now when it has evolved or morphed into something else. And so I would say that that's the best place to start. In there's a link to be able to email me or just to schedule a phone consult or to just even see what kind of offerings are being available at the moment.
And we will put all of your links and, your website, all of that, Dee Dee, will go into the show notes. As we wrap up, what would be your words of wisdom for someone who is in that acute grief right now?
That's a tough one, because I don't know that when we are in acute grief, we're able to absorb words of wisdom or even believe the wisdom that is shared with us. And so what comes to mind is this too shall pass. So in life, our happy moments pass and our sad moments also pass. And being resilient means that we are able to grow despite whatever it is that we're struggling with in the moment. And so it kind of goes back to that question that you had asked me earlier when people say you're so strong. I think the flip side of being so strong is what we would really like to believe is that we're resilient, that we can make it through and be able to continue a life with meaning despite the grieving.
Dee Dee, thank you so much for spending this time with me today and for sharing your deep insights and your compassionate wisdom around such a difficult topic. Thank you for your courage and for the work that you've done in supporting those who are grieving.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Lourdes.
Take good care. Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. You can follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. And finally, if you enjoy Women in Depth, please share with a friend. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.